Was she, this is what I think, was she a cold-hearted killer or a blind caretaker? Or was she both? Hey, academic mamas and academic world, welcome back to True Crime and Tea, where we stir the facts, we steep in analysis, and sip on justice. I'm just going to sip my tea. I'm your host, Lily, and today's case is one that really blurs the line between mercy and murder, duty and destruction. We're heading to post-war Japan, a time marked by devastation, scarcity, and the collapse of social services. And at the center of this dark chapter stands one woman, Miyuki Ishikawa. I think I said that right. A midwife who claimed she was easing suffering, but ended up killing over 100 infants. Trigger warning, trigger warning, trigger warning. This is to do with child mortality. So if this is something that you think you may not be able to listen to, then there is a whole smorgasbord of other academic content over there in my page that you can go and view. I would hate to say goodbye, but I understand. This isn't just a crime story, it's a deep dive into ethics, policy failure, and how vulnerable populations fall through the cracks. Go ahead, pour your tea. You should have it already because you knew you was going to sit down with me, right? Because today we are examining the case of the Demon Midwife of Japan. Yes, that is what they called her. Imagine Tokyo in the late 1940s, a city shattered by war, struggling with starvation, and thousands of orphans. In January 1948, the police made a gruesome discovery: 5 infant corpses, all victims of neglect rather than disease, because where you have war, you have famine, you have disease, but they were not victims of disease. And what emerged from this was basically unbelievable. It was Miyuki Ishikawa, who was a well-educated midwife, and she had orchestrated the deaths of over 100 babies that were entrusted to her care. She was dubbed the Demon Midwife by the media, and it's the story of the Kotobuki Sanin, I don't know if I said that right, Kotobuki maternity home, and this is the Kotobuki Sanin incident. We will be unpacking the crime narrative alongside the post-war context, and then we're going to do a bit of an analysis when we're going to look into the tools of ethics, sociology, and the impact on public health. My goal today is to connect theory to this real case and then sharpen your critical writing skills as we go. So let's look at the historical and social context. So Japan in the 1940s, at the time the country was just coming through from the aftermath of World War II. And there was widespread poverty, there was food shortages, and there's just a fractured healthcare and welfare system, and it left many families unable to support their children. Hospitals and orphanages were overwhelmed with the amount of children and infants, and the infant mortality rate was extremely high. Birth control was limited, and in this chaos, Miyuki Ishikawa was a trained midwife and hospital administrator, becomes a tragic symptom of a broken system. She starts persuading the struggling mothers to abandon or surrender their newborns, and she assures them that they would be cared for. So she told them that she was going to look after their children. That's what she told them. Yeah. Instead, those infants were allowed, and I hate the fact that it puts it as allowed, or even encouraged to die from neglect. After World War II, Japan faced extreme hardships. Wartime destruction and Allied occupation caused chronic food shortages. There were literally corridors of food lines and stories of people who would queue for hours just for a bowl of ramen. And it was also very common that people would be unable to feed their children. They would then be forced to leave their children and leave unwanted, and I don't like to use this term loosely, so in the article they call them unwanted babies, at hospitals, or simply just leave them to die from exposure. On these ramen queues, you would see war orphans as normal. They were seen as normal, and Japanese society was very unprepared with wealth care. There was not something in place that could support these orphans, such as foster parents. They were very, very scarce, and public support systems were almost non-existent. In this setting, the Kotobuki Sanin, a private maternity home in Tokyo's Shinjuku ward, was linked to the fatal tragedies that would then transpire. Miyuki was born in 1897, and she was a Tokyo Imperial University trained midwife. So she's very well educated, and she came from a wealthy family. She married a fellow ex-police officer called Takeshi Ishikawa, and eventually she rose to become the director of Kotobuki. The couple didn't actually have any biological children, and that is an interesting fact, I feel, because the maternal instinct in her doesn't really seem to be switched on at all. Kotobuki Sanin centered largely on supporting unmarried or poor mothers who could not support a baby at that difficult time that was the post-war environment of Japan. The cover-up was unraveled in January of 1948, where a patrol officer encountered a suspicious mortician named Mr. Nagasaki. Some of these names sound so fake, but they're not. They're not from an anime. They found this mortician with multiple baby coffins. When Dr. Nagasaki was confronted, he admitted to cremating 5 infant bodies from Kotobuki, the maternity home, that very day. So he had cremated 5 babies in that one day, and another 20 infants since the previous August. He presented the official death certificates that was signed by a Kotobuki doctor to the officers, so the officers didn't really have any legal grounds to detain him, because technically what he was doing was by the book. He had the death certificates and they were orphans, so therefore they were cremated by him. But they weren't convinced, so the investigators seized the infant bodies from the mortician and they did autopsies on them. And this was a very chilling decision, because the autopsies had showed that the stomachs of the infants were actually empty. 3 had died from malnutrition and 2 had frozen to death. Within days of this discovery, further deaths occurred at the Kotobuki maternity home, and the remaining 7 resident infants were immediately removed for their safety. Authorities raided Kotobuki Sanin, seizing its records, although the review revealed an appalling pattern. So even though they had a thorough review, it then revealed an appalling pattern, and it wasn't just an accident or an epidemic, but these were deliberate and systemic starvations and neglect of over 100 children. 100 children. In other words, each infant's death had been planned. And the mastermind behind this whole planning of these infant deaths was Miyuki Ishikawa herself. She was the head of the maternity facility. She was a highly educated and respected midwife by day, but at night she would do unspeakable things behind closed doors, and there was an unspeakable amount of suffering that went on in this home. So what was her justification for this? She argued that she was performing mercy killings, that it was more humane to let these children die than to let them suffer in poverty or starvation. She even charged the parents a fee, framing it as a form of child disposal. And this is where we need to pause, because this is where we can start looking into the ethics theory. And there are two theories, the utilitarianism theory and the deontology theory, where from a utilitarian perspective, her logic is horrific, but it's internally consistent. It's not like she just changed over time, because she felt that the suffering needed to be reduced by any means necessary. But from a deontological perspective, her actions were categorically immoral, regardless of the outcome, and whichever way you look at it, killing is wrong. So from that perspective, them suffering just needed to happen. It was a means to an end. She had no right to take the lives of these children, looking at those two different perspectives. In modern health ethics, we emphasize autonomy and justice, which Ishikawa violated all of the different health ethics that we would look at, especially justice, because she didn't give the children an opportunity to live. It's almost looking at it through the lens of, okay, they were going to suffer, but how many other children from the 1950s Japan suffered and now are really wealthy, well-to-do, doing amazing in life people? Yes, poverty is an awful thing, and this is not a discussion on how to overcome poverty. This is a discussion on the ethics behind this. So yes, the utilitarian would say, well, take them out of their misery. There's no point in them going through life suffering. They're going to be children that are suffering, and there's you can't see a light at the end of the tunnel. Whereas from a deontological perspective, regardless of how you feel the current situation is, you should never take the autonomy away from that person to be able to do better in the future, right? So regardless of, this is looking at it objectively, feelings, thoughts and emotions out of the, because it's very, very hard to look at this with an objective lens on, because it is so disgusting and outrageous what she's done. Looking at it through an objective lens, you can see two different sides of the coin, and one side is saying, well, do you really want them to suffer, or do you want them to go away peacefully? Which she didn't even do that. She didn't even let them pass away peacefully, because they suffered to death. So I don't know how that justification works in her favor, but apparently it does. And then looking at it from the perspective that we all probably are thinking, you don't have the right to take that decision away from them. But if you was to present that in a paper, you would have to fight and argue those two theories and critically and analyze the evidence that is presented behind those two theories. Newspaper accounts detailed the grim discoveries and said they discovered infant ashes in the Kotobuki backyard, stolen bodies hidden in shrines, and a ledger of an untold number of dead newborns. A ledger is a little book. If you don't know, a ledger is a little book that you write all your accounts in. That's how I know a ledger to be. You write down all your accounts, and you spent this money, and then you got this money. And They had a ledger of an untold number of dead newborns. Now, I want to emphasize that they officially said 100, but the ledger has more. Dare I ask what motivated Ishikawa and her accomplices? Well, in the interviews that were undertaken and trial testimony, it paints a very complex picture. In her own defense, Ishikawa portrayed the victims as unwanted or abandoned, born to mothers who were poor and unable to raise them. And she argued that the government and families had essentially abandoned these babies, leaving the kotobuki to bear the impossible responsibility of making up for what post-war had taken away from them. So kotobuki was forced to raise all these children without the means to do so. In other words, that's what she's basically saying, which is absolute nonsense. But it's clear that Ishikawa herself, she felt that she was solving a problem. She felt that she was solving a dilemma rather than actually committing murders, which is what she was doing. Yeah. Some accounts note that there were simply too many babies and too little support. No social services or charities to assist. And then, given the famine and new foster homes, Ishikawa later hinted that her actions spared the infants from a life of certain destitution, which is a twisted form of mercy killing. Now, in contemporary descriptions, many saw her actions as an act of mercy. Whether she truly believed this or whether she was just using this as a justification to get away with it is very unclear. The infanticide, which is what this is called, infanticide, has been happening for years, and it estimates that it ranged from 85 to 169 deaths, but most sources just settle on around 100 deaths, which is 103 infant victims by Ishikawa's admission. That's how many she said. The number makes Ishikawa Japan's most prolific serial killer and one of history's most prolific female serial killers. We know since then there have been there have been a few more of these maniacs, but as of this research, she's the most prolific female serial killer. Beyond neglect, Ishikawa and her husband profited from the scheme, because remember, they were charging parents. Yeah, they were charging the mothers that couldn't afford to look after their children and kill them. They still charged them. So they were still having to find the funds. It doesn't make any sense. They charged desperate parents large sums of money that they didn't have, telling them that paying the home would cost less than the expense of raising a child. That angers me. I'm trying to read this objectively, but it's actually physically important. I can't read this objectively. It's wild to me that she thinks this is okay. A corrupt doctor, not Dr. Nagasaki, funny enough, Dr. Shiru Nakayama, I really hope I'm saying that correctly, Dr. Shiru Nakayama falsified death certificates. So remember, the doctor said he had the death certificates? Yeah, they were falsified. And why were they falsified, you might ask? They were falsified to make the infant deaths appear to be natural deaths. Essentially, Ishikawa turned this tragedy into a business, orchestrating hidden murders while extracting money from the parents. So, you know, she said that there was mercy killings. Would that need to be financially backed? I just don't really think it would, but that's just me. As a caregiver, the moral perversity of this course is just, her justifications do not match the evidence that is being presented. She claims to be alleviating suffering under extreme conditions, but then this is a case of grievous ethical failure, which is rooted in a dire social breakdown. So as a potential discussion point, you could think about, if you was doing this as an assignment, to what extent does a backstory complicate the moral judgment? So the backstory is we're in post-war struggling Japan. Does that create a justification for the moral judgment that she's made when it comes to, you know, whatever she said, mercy? I don't think it's mercy, but you know. Or was she, this is what I think, was she a cold-hearted killer or a blind caretaker? Or was she both? And how should you write about her claims when it comes to writing an essay? Because you are going to have to take an objective view of this. So you would have to take a seat back. I haven't done this. I'm going to be honest. I haven't done this. But you have to take a seat back, look at the caretaker, look at the cold-hearted killer, look at the evidence that's presented for both sides of that argument, and synthesize that information and critically discuss how evidence kind of supports both instances, but also greatly disputes the fact that she's just a blind caretaker, because there's some intent behind this. She's taking money knowing that she's going to falsify documentation later. So I don't see how you can't come to the conclusion that she is just a cold-hearted killer, but that's just me. In 1948, when the police discovered a number of infant corpses, many of them were hidden in places like storerooms or the funeral home, or when they went to the morgue, the mortician, they found babies there. But here is the twist in this story. I bet you couldn't even guess this twist. She was only sentenced to 8 years, but there's more. She only served 4 of those 8 years. Why? Because at the time, Japanese law did not criminalize neglect leading to infant death. Wild. The law and the culture failed to value the lives of newborns equally. It did not value the life of, it did, but it didn't. The law did not create a space where the life of a newborn was valued. And her light sentence led to, and I'm not surprised, public outcry. Eventually, reforms in Japan meant that there were now Japanese child welfare laws. However, it wasn't the case at the time. This case pushed the authorities to implement better record keeping, birth registrations, and child care policies, which I think is amazing. I don't think it should have been something like this to lead to these things. However, it greatly impacted how they then started recording their information, and they started recording things like births and stuff like that. So it laid the groundwork for a more modern social services. In the courts in 1948, Ishikawa's trial was absolutely sensational. Police formally arrested Miyuki Ishikawa and her husband Takeshi and the mortician Dr. Nagasaki in mid-January of 1948. The autopsies and records were key evidence that was used to be presented in the court. Within weeks, the story was all over the papers, and at trial, Ishikawa's defense was absolutely astonishing. She claimed, like I said before, that these children had been abandoned, and she essentially shifted the blame onto the caretakers, onto the parents. It's their fault why their children died, because they abandoned them. And this argument resonated with a public that wasn't ready to confront society's failures. Many, facing their own surviving struggles, were sympathetic to the idea of the fact that the mothers were poor and had no choice. And in fact, the contemporary reports note that the Japanese public supported Ishikawa's claim that the real fault lay with the families, because they couldn't afford to have children, so why would you reproduce? Basically, that's what they were saying. The verdict and the sentences surprised the world, which doesn't make sense when you look at this from the outside looking in. They said they agreed with the fact that the families had abandoned their children, but then they were surprised that she only got charged to 8 years. I don't understand. Rather than murder charges, the courts treated this case as crimes of omission, akin to involuntary manslaughter. The result was a extraordinarily light sentence, with her only receiving 8 years, and her husband and Dr. Nakayama both only got 4 years each. So technically they would all been out of prison at the same time, which is wild to me. Commentators at the time noted that the judge called them crimes of omission, implying negligence rather than the intent to kill. I can't. Japan's legal system in 1948 did not fully reckon and understand the crimes that Ishikawa performed as premeditated serial murders. Even though we look at this now and we can quite clearly see that she was a serial murderer, they did not come to these conclusions in 1948. The case rattled the nation, and it encouraged reform. Before 1948, Japan's abortion laws were extremely strict, and even at a time where unwanted pregnancies were on the rise, shock and shame around Kotobuki's scandal helped to push new policy. Only 6 months after Ishikawa's arrest, the Japanese passed the Mother's Body Protection Act, July the 13th, 1948, and this act is also called the Eugenic Protection Law, which effectively legalizes abortion for economic reasons, and this was put in place by 1949. This is not a discussion about whether you think this is right or not. This is just the outcome of what happened after this woman decided to take it into her own hands to unalive all these children. So in other words, the government moved towards offering poor mothers a legal alternative to abandon or unknowingly endanger their babies. Even if it still is stigmatized, they've given them a legal option to then say, okay, this is the situation that you're in. Instead of giving it to someone like this demon nurse, you can use this facility that's available to you. Many historians actually see this as a direct response to prevent more tragedies by easing the population's pressure, rather than just ignoring the fact that they were going through what is systemic challenges. When we look at this through a lens of leadership, systemic accountability, and professional ethics, This is a very, very cautionary tale because Ishikawa was in a position of power within a healthcare institution. She was the director. Her leadership, though, was extremely unethical because she was encouraging people to do things like falsify documentation. It was left unchecked because obviously she is the one that is in charge, and it enabled silence. You didn't want to speak out, or people didn't potentially want to speak out against what she was doing. So therefore, and this was the result of her because she was in a position of power. And it gives room for comparison to things like the theory of institutional power, where control is exerted not just through overt actions, but through systems, surveillance, and complicity. People just complying even though this is not the correct way to act. A very good example of this is the case that kind of catapulted the implementation of this freedom to speak up guardians, because of a case where a nurse was effectively silenced and others around just left the situation as it was, because those that were in positions of power were creating such challenging situations and environments for them. And there were extremely poor practices going on at the time. They then went through a process that has now led to the freedom to speak up guardians within the NHS. Whether you think it's a good functionality or not, that is up to your own opinion. However, that was put in place because of things like systemic complicity, where people are just complying to what other people are doing because they are too scared to speak up, because those that are in positions of power can make their lives really, really difficult if they wanted to. The case of Ishikawa isn't just a story of one woman's choices. It's a mirror reflecting society's values, because the society at the time did not value the lives of those newborn children, hence why there wasn't things in place that could support those families. And therefore, she was able to get away with a lot of the things that she got away with. It's also about what happens when poverty is criminalized. You were almost punished for not being able to support your children, and not necessarily punished by the system, punished by someone like Ishikawa. With children being so dehumanized as well, it's the fact that nobody was watching the system that needed to protect the vulnerable. Therefore, she was able to get away with what she got away with. And as students, this case is one that you can think about very, very critically, because there are so many different elements that can go into this one situation. I could probably go on and do a completely new video looking at the different academic lenses that are presented just with this one case, because when you consider things like reading policy or studying the ethics of this case, not just what happened but what resulted from the actions of 1, 2, 3 people that were actually convicted, and not convicted fairly because they only got 4 to 8 years. But what was allowed to happen because the system was not set up to support these families. And though the outcome was still something that is still very stigmatized, they legalized a way to, get rid of unwanted children, there was still an outcome from that situation. Even looking at that through the lens of policy and how ethics contributes to that is a completely another discussion that we can have, and a much wider discussion that we can have. Ishikawa's story is both horrifying and thought-provoking. It really does make you think about the systemic challenges that people face, and how the systems that are put in place or not put in place can impact those that are living in that environment. It forces us to ask the question, what do we owe are most vulnerable. In terms of the healthcare system, our most vulnerable being the children, the elderly, the people with additional needs, the staff that we work with that are maybe younger, that are neurodivergent, that have disabilities. What do we owe those vulnerable populations? Even in dire circumstances, we know our society condemn midwives' direct role in infant deaths. We've seen it through things like Lucy Letby. There was that lady in 1994. There was this case, Ishikawa's case. We know that there is condemnation when it comes to the involvement of midwives and nurses and infant deaths. But we also need to ask, how did society collapse contribute to this tragedy? Because we know that the direct result of post-war poverty led parents who were not able to look after their child to seek help. That help came in the form of Ishikawa, and instead of Ishikawa actually doing that, helping them, she herself didn't have the provision to look after those children, but she was still taking the money from the parents to then not look after those children. And we know what the result of that was. But what did the societal collapse contribute to that specific scenario? When we study Ishikawa and we look at her through an academic lens and look at her objectively, we see complex forces involved in this case. Ethical, social, economic, they all collide. They all come together and give us this miasma of loads of different perspectives that we can see in this specific case. Some of the questions for reflection that we may have when it comes to Ishikawa's case is, how might Ishikawa's socio-economic context have shaped her choices? Remember, she was well off, she was well educated, she came from a wealthy family. She probably looked down on these poor families and questioned why they haven't had children. She herself didn't have children. So could a different policy like better welfare have changed the outcome of this particular situation? And then we've got something that's called the Miyuki. Now, I haven't gone into detail about Miyuki in this video, but the Miyuki is the infanticide as a population control. In other words, getting rid of these unwanted children wasn't a bad thing because it would have positively impacted society, because the less mouths to feed, the better, essentially. If you want to look more into that, I will link the book about this infanticide in the description. But considering the concept of Miyuki, how does the historical idea compare to Ishikawa's rationale? Do you even agree with it? Because I don't agree with her rationale, because I think she's lying. But how does that compare to the reasons that she said she did this? And then final question for reflection. How does this case change or reinforce your views on how society should treat mothers and children in crisis? Now, many societies now, we have some form of social service, but does this particular case contribute to the way you yourself perceive the mother and children in crisis scenario, and how much of an impact society should have in caring for these groups of people? Feel free to debate these questions in the comments. I would love to see some of your answers, and also bring this forward to your classmates and your peers and have these discussions with them, critically challenging yourself to be open to different theories and different thoughts. There is no easy answer. I mean, there is, we know she's wrong, but there are no easy answer to some of these reflective questions. But grappling with them will strengthen your ability to be a critical thinker. You can't just think, or you shouldn't just think of, we know it's wrong. Yes, we know it's wrong, but looking at all of the other contributing factors, what conclusions have you and can you draw? That's it for today. This was a really lengthy one. I know it was. I hope you enjoyed the length of it. And if you are still here, thank you for sticking around, and I'm going to assume that you enjoyed it. This was a very difficult case to read, to research, and to try and look at objectively, because it has such lasting implications, and as a mother, I just can't see how this would even happen, but it did. If this episode stirred your thoughts, please share it with a fellow student, with a fellow colleague, with mother, with your friends, and leave a comment. Let's keep using these real cases to sharpen up our critical thinking. Thank you for watching this episode of True Crime and Tea. If you found this analysis interesting, please subscribe and turn on that notification bell so you know when I have released a new video. This is where we link true crime to academic insights, and I have had so much fun discussing this with you today. I encourage you to comment below with your thoughts and your questions and suggestions of other cases that you'd like us to look at through a critical lens, especially if you're a student and you're on your academic journey and you want to explore some different topics. Please let us discuss them in the comments and I'll potentially make a video of it. Stay curious, stay critical, keep learning, and until next time, stay sharp, stay reflective, and as always, sip responsibly. See you in the next video. Bye.